Good morning and welcome to UK BIC's regular webinar series. We're just going to wait another minute or so to begin the webinar, just to allow more people to join the call. So if you can just bear with us, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Let's begin. Morning and thank you for joining the call, our 15th webinar in the series. In this series, we'll take you behind the scenes of the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, sharing insights, analysis and real-world expertise across our capabilities. Today's session is led by Dr. Helen Walker, UK BIC's Senior Simulation Engineer. Helen will provide an in-depth look at best practice in electrode slurry characterisation, explore key challenges in physics-based modelling of electrode coating processes, and show how CFD-generated datasets can be used to develop machine learning reduced order models. We'll also be joined later for the Q&A by two further UK BIC specialists and colleagues of Helen's, Natasha Pines, an analytical scientist, and Nevidorava Kemalavu, data scientist, who will be supporting Helen in answering your questions. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function in Teams. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible by the end of the session. If you want to contact UK BIC after the webinar, you can email sales@ukbic.co.uk or info@ukbic.co.uk. If you're a supplier, use suppliers@ukbic.co.uk. And the good news is that a copy of the slides, a recording of the webinar, and more excitingly, a new technical paper will be available via UK BIC's website from this coming Monday. So just before I hand over to Helen, just going to give a bit of background about UK BIC for those of you who are not familiar with us. Based in Coventry in the West Midlands in England, UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, or UK BIC for short, is a national scale-up facility created to bridge the gap between cutting-edge battery research and commercial production. We're a delivery partner for the UK Government's Battery Innovation Programme, funded by the Department for Business and Trade and delivered by Innovate UK. Our engineers and specialists bring deep hands-on expertise across the full battery manufacturing process. We work closely with innovators to solve real-world challenges and accelerate the development of next-generation battery technologies. Our focus is simple. We help innovators bring advanced battery products to market faster, more efficiently, and with greater confidence. And without further ado, I suggest we get on with the webinar. And the webinar today is coupling slurry characterisation with CFD and machine learning reduced order modelling as best practice to reduce slot die coating defects in electrode scale-up. And I'm going to hand over to Dr. Helen Walker, Senior Simulation Engineer at UK BIC. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So today, so today we really wanted to.
Sorry.
Sorry, we're just getting a bit of feedback. Sorry. So yeah, today we wanted to take you through the work that we've done around physics-based modelling of slot die coating. We've done quite a journey at UK BIC, from slurry characterisation to the modelling itself, to then exploring what can be done with those models. It's been 3 or 4 years of learning in the making, and we wanted to share to the wider world all of the learning that we've gained. So just a little bit of introduction to process simulation at UK BIC and why we do it. So as you know, we are a scale-up facility. Customers come to us and they want to take the next step on their TRL level. And so often they might have a whole product or part of a product that they want to develop or scale up. And so the first use for process simulation is doing due diligence on that customer design and to check the feasibility of the step that they want to make in that scale-up journey. We might not necessarily have the same equipment at UK BIC that customers have used previously, so we also want to do that simulation to check that the manufacturing methods that we're going to use at UK BIC are transferable on that material. And then within technology, this is for me the most interesting bit, doing these physics-based simulation models allow us to understand why something happens. You can interrogate them, look at the flow field, look at the stress fields, and understand why something's happening. Ultimately, the benefit for our customers is reducing wasted material and time on the line. You know, customers come with a fixed amount of material. We want to maximise what we can get out of it. So if we're able to simulate a process in advance, we can then, you know, get started on the line in the most efficient possible way. And then once we have a validated model, you can then do rapid process optimization. It unlocks virtual design of experiments, which are just not feasible in the battery industry in the real world because materials are so expensive. So we use process simulation throughout a campaign at all stages. So sometimes we will use simulation at the RFI stage, the request for information stage, and that is because we might need to do a bit of feasibility. Can this even be done at UK BIC before we kick off a project? After project kickoff, we'll do lots of material characterisation to feed into that modelling activity. We do the modelling activity and then we feed the process parameters. So we work really closely with the process engineers. We go into production, and then after production, we're then looking at data. We're revisiting the lab with any other characterisation we might need to do. We're using that data to validate the models, and then that will then go into any reporting that we need to do to our customer. At UK BIC, process simulation is particularly powerful. You know, you can go to any consultancy company for simulation, but we have the experience in modelling battery-specific processes. We have our laboratory on site, very, very comprehensive laboratory, and we've got the skills to analyse battery slurries, electrodes, etc., etc. And then we have that proximity between the simulation engineers and the process engineers, you know, and the back and forth that can go between them. And then we have data science capability at UK BIC, and that's why my colleague Nivi has joined us today, because we can do really advanced data analytics on any of the simulation data, but also any of the production data at UK BIC. So when we started up process simulation at UK BIC, we identified coating as one of the biggest opportunities really to save time and money for our customers. And yeah, it was one of the pain points. So we chose slot die coating, and what we really wanted to do was determine how to achieve stable, uniform coating ahead of production. That was the problem we wanted to solve, and so we wanted to develop physics-based models that could predict coat uniformity across the web, predict any high edges, and also give us an idea of how stable that window is. And so the solution is to produce these computational fluid dynamics, or CFD models, of the process to predict this uniformity. There are a number of reasons why modelling slot die coating is complicated. Firstly, the physics is complicated. You've got, you're not only modelling the slurry, which is shear thinning, it's not a constant viscosity. As we apply a force to that slurry, the viscosity drops. But you're also having to model the interaction between the slurry and the air around it. And that makes it multi-phase, as we would call it. We have large differences in spatial scales. So you've got coating, which is a few hundred microns thick, or maybe even less than 100 microns thick, but you might be coating hundreds of millimeters wide. To resolve that and what we call discretize that problem, chop it into pieces, you need lots and lots of elements or lots of pieces to do that, which means you end up with very, very big computational problems. Today's webinar, we're going to focus on continuous coating. So we've got a steady problem, but if we were to model intermittent coating, that would make a problem unsteady. So you're then having to model the problem evolving in time, which also would add complexity. And then, as you know, this is a really high precision engineering environment. If you're solution is not really accurate and really precise, there's no point in doing it. So those demands mean you've got to really resolve your problem to, within a couple of microns. I mentioned the complicated physics. So it's worth noting that at UKVic, we have two types of coating regime. So on our main industrial scale line, we do dual-sided coating. So we coat what we call our A side onto a backing roller, which actually makes the problem quite simple. But after we've coated onto one side, we coat onto the second side underneath. And because your A side is wet, you then have to coat onto your B side with the web under tension. Now our dryers are 40 meters long. So the moment the web comes off the A roller, it's under tension for a very, very long time. And so to model the B side coating, as we would call it, and the slot die coating onto a tension web where the web is flexing, again, adds a level of complexity. So depending on whether we're modeling backing roller coating or web coating, you need different physics. On this schematic here, so you can see in all cases we need multi-phase and non-Newtonian flow. We might need that fluid structure interaction if we're modeling the B-side coating. And then if we've got a particularly elastic slurry, you might want to add in viscoelastic effects. Now, this is not something that I will cover today. I'll remark on elasticity in slurries, but it's something we've been working with our university partners on. So for those who don't have a background in multi-physics models, these are the key building blocks of a model. So we need our governing equations, and we've said, they're already going to be pretty complicated because of the physics involved. We need a geometry, so a CAD geometry of our slot die and maybe our backing roller. If your supplier of your slot die is feeling very kind, they might give this to you, or you might have to acquire a geometry in another way. Then we need material properties. I'm going to go into detail, into serious detail on this in the next few slides. Then we have to have what we would call our boundary conditions. So we need to know how much slurry we're applying, if we've got an air domain, how we're going to model those outlets. Then I've mentioned the word discretization. So our spatial discretization is how we would chop things up into space. Temporal discretization is not relevant for today. And then your numerical solver is all the maths that's going to go on in the background to solve the problem. Now, if you're using commercial CFD packages, these are already so developed and really robust. And quite often you only need to tweak a few of the default settings, perhaps. That's done for you. So once you've got your geometry, your process parameters and your material properties, you would feed that into your simulation, apply your physics and your governing equations, and the package will do all the numerics and you'll get a solution. We would then use the solution to inform the process, get data out of that process, and then if the data from inline gauges or offline measurements doesn't match the model, we would then have to go back to the model, revisit the physics. Are we missing some physics? Have we meshed something incorrectly? And you would go back in this circle around and round until your simulation matches your process data, and then you have a validated model. So on to the materials. So we've spent many years perfecting how we characterize our slurries. And this started with a project that we did with the University of Birmingham. It was an industrial fellowship. And the project looked at a number of things. It looked at how to characterize your slurries properly, but then also once you'd determine that, how formulation and mixing parameters can affect rheology. And so we took from that project lots of best practices on slurry characterization, and that's what I'll take you through today. So for the CFD model, you need 3 parameters. You need a contact angle measurement. So that is the angle when you place a droplet of slurry onto your foil substrate, the angle it makes with that substrate. You need surface tension. That is the proclivity of a liquid to want to minimize its surface area. It wants to come back together and the molecules want to be as close to each other as possible. And then you also need information about the rheology. So that is how the viscosity of the slurry might change with shear rate. And then you also might look at elasticity. And that is You know, these slurries flow and they behave in a viscous manner, but then they also in part can behave like a solid. So I'll start with contact angle. So at UK BIC, we use an oscillar contact angle goniometer, and we do static contact angle measurements. And our method really is to stick the foil that we're going to use onto a glass slide, trying to get it as nice and as flat as possible, but also trying not to contaminate that foil. We want it as it's going to be on the line. And then we pop a droplet of the slurry or whatever liquid we're analysing on that slide, and you use the software to fit the angle. Now, some of the key learnings from the work we did with Birmingham was that the choice of pipette and the droplet size is really important. We don't want a pipette tip that's too narrow, because then you'll get a droplet that is depleted in all of the good stuff in the slurry. But we also don't want to deposit too large a drop, because we don't want that droplet to flatten under the forces of gravity. So the work determined that an optimal protocol was to deposit 10 microlitres of slurry 10 times with 100 microlitre pipette and take an average of 10 readings. And just to show you, that's what it looks like when you're looking at the software on the computer. You can see we've got this nice droplet, and the software will automatically have a guess at the angles, and then you can tweak it slightly. So that's how we characterise our contact angle of our slurry. Next up is the surface tension measurement. Now, this is the characteristic of the slurry that's been most tricky for us to measure. So we use the Wilhelmy plate method. Now, this method typically is you're dropping or lowering a platinum plate into your liquid. You then retract the plate, and the instrument is measuring the force on that plate, and from that it can calculate the surface tension of the liquid. However, we found that the platinum plate was very, very difficult to clean after it's been submerged in the slurries. And hopefully you can see on the image to the right there that you can see almost a line where the slurry has been. And we tried all sorts of methods, all sorts of solvents to clean this plate, flaming it. But then when we were trying to recalibrate it essentially in water, we were not getting the correct value for water. So we knew we weren't cleaning it sufficiently. So we started to look for alternatives, because it just became, not feasible to do in this environment. So we worked quite closely with Biolin, the supplier of our instrument, and we came up with an alternative. So what we've done is we've moved to a glass plate, and it has a slightly different perimeter, and the contact angle that the liquid makes with the plate is different. So you have to do a bit of correcting. But we've been able to correctly measure the surface tension of water with this setup. And so now going forward, we've got a method that we can characterise our slurries with, because we can easily clean the glass, disposable. So that was one of the really big things that we've been working on. And then the final thing is, well, the second to last thing I'll say is viscosity. So at UK BIC, there are two viscosity protocols on our rheometer that we follow. So we can do a standard flow curve where we have our gap of our parallel plates in the rheometer to about 1 mil, and that allows us to achieve a flow curve of about 0.01 to 600 or 1,000 reciprocal seconds. What you can do is you can optimize the gap between those parallel plates to achieve a flow curve over a wider range of shear rates. And so the work that Birmingham did, where they took that took that gap between the rheometer plates down to about 0.2 mil, and they were able to really push the boundaries of that flow curve. You just have to be careful, because you don't want that gap to be getting anywhere near your largest agglomerate or particle size. And when you start to see results that clearly look dodgy, discount them. So now, when you have your viscosity data, quite often commercial CFD packages will ask for, will have models for the viscosity. So what you need to do is fit your raw data to one of these models. Cross, Caro, power law. The important thing to note when you're doing this is that when you're fitting the data, fit the data in the log space. So, you know, when we look at flow curves, we always plot them on a log graph, because otherwise it would be really hard to interpret. When you're doing your least squares in the bit of code that you create, fit it in the log space so that you, over all decades of shear rate, you're weighting it fairly. And then the last thing, a UK bit that we would look at is your elasticity measurements. And I won't go into too much detail here because you could spend a whole other webinar on elasticity. But a UK BIC, we do an amplitude sweep to make sure we've got our linear viscoelastic region. And then we take a strain from that region to do an amplitude sweep. And we're looking for the value of tan delta. Now, there are ways in which you can relate the elasticity and the tan delta value to your regime in coating to determine whether elasticity will be important or not, but it's very complicated. And actually at UK BIC, if our tan delta is greater than 1, we know it's pretty unproblematic to coat. What we have found is that when we have this tan delta value around half or less, it can also mean the slurry is really difficult to pump. So yeah, anything less than 1, red flags start to arise, and we start to anticipate the other problems that we could have on the line. Okay, so once we've got all of those wonderful material properties, we've got our geometry, we know what physics are going to solve, we can then move to the package, bring in that geometry, and this is where it's important to note that because coating is a symmetric process for us, I only have to model half of the coater. So if you see graphs in this webinar where it's only essentially half of the web, that's why, because I've exploited symmetry to save computational time. So yeah, we've got our geometry, and you can see here on the right hand side, what I'm looking at is the fluid domains that are interesting. So I've got an inlet, I've got my slot dome manifold, I've got my thin shim region, as we would call it, which is providing that pressure drop, which is the thing that's distributing the flow. And then I've got an external fluid region. So you can see at the curve there is where my roller is, and then I've got some initially air domain that my slurry is allowed to flow into. So my roller's rotating. Now, I mentioned that these problems are difficult because of how many pieces you have to chop the problem up into. A typical coating model at UK BIC for what we would call half width coating, so sort of 300 mil wide, I've got about 12 million-ish elements. So it's doable in these commercial software packages, but you know, the simulations can take a long time. And when I'm chopping up my problem into these tiny pieces, you have to refine your mesh in the areas that are of interest. So if you've got a lot going on in an area, high velocity gradients, you want a really fine mesh. If I've got an area where there's just some air floating around, not really near anything, I can have a coarser mesh. So we can be quite selective in how we chop up our domain. And then when we come into in this case, ANSYS Fluent, we can then start interrogating the solution. So in this instance, I get from far away, I get, oh, it looks like a nice uniform lovely coating. If I interrogate it, I take a slice through that coating a little bit downstream of the dye lips, I can then see some cross-web profiles. So here I've got the dashed line will be my wet target film thickness, or my wet coat weight thickness, and then the orange is what the simulation for these process parameters and this rheology is predicting. And so in this instance, I've got quite nice uniform coating, except at the end where I've got a high edge. This high edge is not ideal for your final cell, but in the immediate term, if you've got a high edge at coating, when that coating is building up on rewind, when your dry electrode is building up, it can lead to web break. So it's really important to not have it for that reason. Also, if you have a high edge that's too severe, you can't calendar it either. So there are process reasons why you don't want a high edge, never mind it not being great for putting in your cell. So once you've got this baseline model, you can try out different rheologies, different process parameters to try and alleviate perhaps your non-uniformity or your high edge. So at UK BIC, what we want to do is we want to be able to set up our slot die right first time. So a couple of the key questions are, what thickness should we have that shim? And so on the left-hand side, I've plotted two cases where I've run a simulation with a 500 micron shim and a 750 micron shim. And this kind of shows, if you read in literature, the classical happy, sad face scenario where if your shim is too thin, you'll have a happy face. The slurry in the manifold is pushed to the external regions. And so you get more higher coat weight on the outer parts of your web. But if your shim is too wide, too thick, you get more flow down the middle. And then you get a sad face. And the model matches exactly what we see in the literature. And we know from experience. Another parameter the process engineers quite like is the on-coat position, the distance between the foil and the die lips, so that we get that right first time. And I've plotted here three scenarios where I've got an on-coat position of 195, 175, and 155 microns. And again, from experience and what we know from the theory, the closer your slot die gets to wet film thickness, the less likely you are to have a high edge. This building of high edge in the literature is something called necking. And what it is that when the slurry is leaving that slot die, the slot die lips, there's loads of competing phenomena. You've got the inertial and viscous forces that are acting down the web, but then you've also got that surface tension trying to pull the slurry in. So it's the competition between those things happening. And so what we try and do at this point is say to the process engineers, you want your on-coat position to be this, and you want to use this shim, happy coating. I mentioned that what we do is we have to validate our simulations after we've completed them. So what I've got here is the simulation solution plotted in orange, and then we've got line side measurements, micrometer measurements plotted with the blue dots. And then we have an inline coat weight measurement in the solid blue line. And we see really good agreement between the simulation and the offline micrometer measurements. The discrepancy between the inline coat weight measurements is because the inline coat weight system has to average a coat weight over an area. So inevitably when that area that it's averaging over slips off the coating, it's going to, artificially lower the coat weight. So we see really, really good agreement. In this scenario, we informed the process and we got really good coating. I can assure you that I have modelled some other scenarios where we've had a high edge in reality and the model has predicted a high edge. But this is an excellent example of where it's worked. So once we've ran this model over and over again, many different process parameters, many different formulations, we then generate a data set. And it's what can you do with that data set to improve your learning? So initially, you could start with something quite simple, do a statistical analysis, look at such as Pearson correlation, and look at some of the linear relationships between things. So if I just zoom in. I've got a rogue square there. We can see some of the relationships that we might recognise. So, for example, here you can see contact angle, linearly related to edge height, and this is saying it's positive number. So, as one thing goes up, the other thing goes up. So, we would expect a higher contact angle to have a higher chance of having a high edge. A couple of other things that we might recognise. So, for example, coat speed. Negatively correlated. So we know that coat speed is a really good lever that we can pull to reduce high edges. The faster you coat, the less likely you're going to have a high edge. And that's because I mentioned earlier, high edges are caused by the competing phenomena of surface tension and inertia. If you're coating quicker, your slurry's got less time and that surface tension's got less time to take effect. And so you've got a less chance of having a high edge. However, you've got to be cautious in some instances when looking at these results, because I spent a lot of time saying on-coat position is important for high edges. But here, the linear analysis is saying that there's no correlation. But remember, this type of linear analysis isn't going to highlight relationships if they're non-linear or they're co-founded or your data is insufficient. And another thing to point out, for example, I've highlighted the surface tension. Here, it's not really showing that it's correlated, but that is because there is insufficient data there. I spoke at length how difficult it was to get surface tension values. So lots of the data in this data set only has a few surface tension values. So what I'm really saying here is you can do these analyses, be really, really critical. And then another one to point out, you've probably noticed the really dark blue squares. So solid content, density, pre-dye pressure, all really closely related. That the analysis is saying that as those things go up, so as density goes up, the chance of having a high edge goes down. And again, coming back to the argument over high edges being caused by the balance between surface tension and inertial effects, if you've got a denser slurry, it's coming out that slot die, it's more dense, it's got more momentum, surface tension is going to have to work harder to overcome that momentum. So some of the insights make sense physically, some of them, you've got to question it. And this is where our data scientist comes into things. So I mentioned that the simulations are slow and that there is linear analyses aren't perfect. There are more sophisticated models out there that we can use to fit to the simulation data to produce a reduced order model, which is, number one, quicker. So we can turn around answers for process engineers in a shorter time. But they are, and they still capture the underlying physics because they've been trained on that simulation data set, but they are, easier to deploy. And surprisingly, they might highlight unknown relationships. Now, with machine learning and reduced order modeling, the quality of your model is going to massively depend on the quality and the volume of the training data that you have. So again, I guess it's something to be aware of and to be cautious of. So simulation provided a data set to our data scientist, which was comprised of 67 simulations, 19 different UK-BIC formulations, and we benchmarked 13 different machine learning models. And the aim of this model was to predict edge height from the rheology, the contact angle, the process parameters. And in the paper that we're going to release on Monday, we go into huge depth on this. So for those of you from a machine learning type background, there'll be loads of data on this. But essentially, this relatively simple model called the ridge model outperformed more complex models. And there's just some comparison there for you. What the machine learning model did was highlighted different parameters that were more important. So on this slide, we've got comparison of your Pearson correlation, which shows your RAR squared number, and then the equivalent of that for this ridge model is what we call SHAP importance. And so you can see how the totally different approaches have picked out different parameters. Some they picked out similar parameters, but they have picked out different parameters. And the key benefit of this is that these models will then evaluate in milliseconds instead of hours. So what we've presented is now a full workflow, really, right through from slurry characterisation to CFD modelling to reduced order modelling. But I mentioned that there's a few things that are neglected or there's still room for improvement. So on the elasticity, we've been working with the University of Southampton to model intermittent coating and compare the results that we get with just modelling the non-Newtonian nature and the elastic nature. And there'll be publications coming out around this, but we do find that depending on the model that you use, the leading and trailing of the edges that you get in your patches does differ. I mentioned that the models that I've been developing are hugely computationally expensive. These are phenomenally computationally expensive. We're running on HPC for a day or so. So we need to, well, I guess any machine learning that could be done on this would be especially valuable. So conclusions, 3 main things I'd like everyone to take away from this. Number 1, accurate slurry characterisation can be challenging, and there are a few best practices that we've worked long and hard to determine. The CFD modelling gives you really valuable insight into what is happening ahead of time, but you're limited by high computational cost and long run times, perhaps. And then we can and have successfully applied machine learning methods to develop reduced order methods, which will enable process engineers to turn around, well, for us to turn around optimal parameters quicker for our process engineers, but always bearing in mind, and at every stage being very, very critical, and bearing in mind the underlying physics. So I think back to Richard now.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm just going to take back control. And just bear with us. Thank you very much, Helen, for that very detailed presentation, really thorough. Hope you'd agree. Just to flag, on Monday, we're going to have a new technical paper which the webinar is based on, going to be available on our website and shared externally, along with the recording of the webinar and the slide deck too. And we're going to start now with some questions. We've had some in already, which is fantastic. And we've also had some in advance of today as well. So I'm going to introduce Helen's 2 colleagues, Nivi and Natasha. So let's get underway. So the questions which we received in advance, if I can begin, this one's for Helen. Did you try any software packages other than ANSYS?
So, sorry, I've got a bit of feedback again. Oh, that's a really good question. When we began process simulation at UKBIC, we considered a few different suppliers, some of the big names, Star CCM, Dassault, etc. And I guess we chose ANSYS because they had many examples of battery manufacturing processes already. So we knew that the software was capable of modelling slot die coating, of modelling web tension coating. And so they impressed us with that. I can't see any reason why any of the major packages wouldn't be able to manage it. One thing I would say is our colleagues at Southampton tried to model the intermittent coating with ANSYS Polyflow and really struggled to reach the high Weissenberg numbers, a number related to elasticity. So they did end up moving to OpenFOAM. But yeah, I can't see why any other commercial package wouldn't be suitable.
The next question, again, we had it in advance of today, which is one for Natasha. Natasha, how did you try cleaning the Wilhelmy plate?
Yeah, so cleaning the Wilhelmy plate caused me a lot of pain, to be honest. So the slurry really gets into the surface of the plate. So I tried several different things. So they recommend only really using solvents, but I really found that that wasn't doing anything. So I tried various things like using NMP, because that's the kind of main solvent used in our slurry, in our cathode slurry, which was generally the problem one. I also tried even using acid to see if we could try and break down what we think might be PVDF residue, and that didn't really seem to work either. The supplier suggested using like a blowtorch or like a plasma torch, so we did purchase a blowtorch as well, which did have a little bit of improvement, but it was a very long process trying to get it to clean off, and we did manage to get it back to working, but then as soon as we tried a slurry again, it just went back to not working properly again. So yeah, so I tried a whole host of different things to get there, but I think Helen's solution of the glass plate is probably going to be a lot easier for us.
Great, thank you. And this one's for Nivi. Do you trust the machine learning model?
That's a great question, because a black box model like machine learning that explains to fit the data proves nothing about physics, but showing the machine learning independently recovers the same mechanism the CFD predicts, which is example code speed, which reduces high edges, and on-code mechanism, which is causing the neck-in. And these all demonstrated in learning the real physics, which is what justifies trusting it as fast stands in for the simulation. And we deliberately leave out one particular mix on the entire slurry, forcing the model to predict the formulation in it has never seen before, which is the real production scenario. And what we expected is something novel, and it actually reveals the flexibility model, and it overfed the new formulation that what we expected.
Thank you. And another one for Helen. Do you use high power computing?
So yeah, that's absolutely, we could do that to speed up our simulations. We've tried 2 cloud computing platforms. So we've tried the ANSYS's own offering, ANSYS Burst, and we've also been using a company called Rescale, which is also really well integrated with ANSYS. Both do, as you can imagine, accelerate the solve time, and it scales really, really well. The only problem that we have is that these files are quite big. So when we're uploading and downloading the case and the data files, that almost eats away at the savings that you can make. In very, very long simulations, if we're modelling, full width coating, really wide coating, the slurry is pretty tricky, it will be worth accelerating it with HPC. But some of the shorter models, you might spend 10, 15 minutes uploading, spinning up a cluster, and then maybe the same in the reverse. So actually you've spent half an hour just getting your file to and from the HPC. So yeah, it depends on the specifics of your model.
I think it's another question for Helen. If coating consists of 2-stripe in continuous coating, would half simulation of the slop die provide accurate results?
Okay, yeah, so I have modelled 3-stripe coating. So I guess in that scenario, in my model, I end up having sort of half a stripe in the middle and then another full stripe. That's no problem. I'm guessing in the case of 2 stripes and you've got a mass-free zone on my symmetry boundary, again, I can't see why that would be problematic at all. But yeah, we've successfully done it for 3 stripes.
That's great. How do you approach B-side coating simulation after A-side coating, as B-side coating will be influenced by the quality, thickness loading of the A side?
Okay, so B side is something that we have under develop at the moment. The problem with our B side is there's many problems with our B side. Because we have our web like pinned coming off the roller from our A side, and then our B side is pinned 40 meters downstream. There's no way that we could model all of that. So before we began a simulation in ANSYS, for example, we would know exactly where to pin that web in our truncated domain. And then we also need to know, yeah, it's very, very tricky. So what we've done instead, we're not trying to tackle B-side at the moment in a massive CFD package. We have reverted to literature and analytical models. So it's something that's still very, very in development. And it'll probably be next year before we're able to say what we've been doing with B-side. But it's going to be complicated. And you're right. How do we get the material properties of that web when it's not just the foil, it's got loading on already? Yeah.
That's great. I think one of the questions here is for Nivi. I'm wondering if it is possible to develop AI surrogate models to accelerate the computation.
Yes, I think of it. CFD simulations are likely running a very detailed and slow experiment on computers and computational powers, which is required a lot amount. And AI surrogacy model is kind of a smart shortcut that we can able to predict in milliseconds, and it's quite faster in terms of realistic work. And what we need in terms of to train AI is to provide huge amount of simulation data set to feed in to predict accurately, and it's useful for quickly testing ideas or optimizing designs, but you still need the original CFD sometimes to keep things accurate.
Yeah, I can add to that. Yeah, 67, perhaps doesn't feel like many cases. And so, as we cope more at UKVIC, we'll add to that data set, and then Nivi can rerun her models and develop them further.
That's great. Thank you. Another question is, how do the simulations translate to the real world? In particular, what scrap rate or percentages of scrap rate can manufacturers expect when ramping up their coating operations, and what is the sensitivity to line speed?
Wow. Yeah, UKVIC is in a bit of a unique position because we are scale up, so we very, very rarely run the same product all the time. Every customer that we have that comes along has a different formulation. So we don't have lots of experience in running, 100, 200 of the same mixes. At UKVIC, I guess I can comment that, we've gone from in our coating run having to set up our slot die 3 different times to now getting our slot die set up right first time. And yeah, we're seeing yields, pretty good yields.
That's great, Helen, thank you. Final question, we've not received any further in other than, can we also simulate the influence of bubble trapped in the slurry for the coating simulation?
Yeah, this is something that I've thought about for a while because there was a time at UKVIC where we had quite a few problems with air in our slurries. I think to model bubbles trapped in the slurry and translating through the slot die and down the shim region, it's just not feasible. But we did loads and loads of work on degassing our slurries. We have a degas model, so it's hopefully now sufficiently degassing our slurries so there's no air in our slurries from mixing. We did a lot of work on streamlining our pump carts, so we're not in training air. Yeah, so I think it's just better to not have any air in your slurry initially. And then I also noticed, Sufi, you also mentioned the statistical analysis seems not to include the foil characteristic of surface energy. And that's because that is wrapped up in the contact angle. So the surface energy of the foil will impact the contact angle it makes. So it's included, it's just wrapped up in another parameter.
That's great. Thank you very much. I don't think we've got any other questions in. So we're going to move on to the end of the webinar today. Just to flag, UK BIC will have a trade stand at the Battery Cells and Systems Expo on the 8th and 9th of July. So please come and speak to my colleagues on the stand. I know Helen and Nivi should be at the show, which would be great. So you'll be able to speak to them then as well in person. And I just want to conclude today's webinar. I'd like to thank our 3 speakers. And if you want to get in touch, please email sales@ukbic.co.uk or info@ukbic.co.uk, and you'll be able to see our technical paper, the webinar, and the slides from Monday, along with all the previous webinar recordings, which are on our website now. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.